If the girl herself cannot attract a respectable husband, perhaps her picture can still raise a few pounds for the chapel. The first laugh came from the back of the room, then another, then the sound spread, polite enough to be denied, cruel enough to wound. Celeste stood very still, and in that moment she understood something with perfect clarity. Her stepmother had not brought the painting out because it was valuable. She had brought it out because it was the last place Celeste's mother had still existed. And tonight, before all of society, Lady Maricel meant to sell even that. Before Lady Celeste Ashbourne became the woman everyone pitied, she had once been a child everyone envied. Not for her dresses, though they were made of the finest silk from Lyon, not for the silver combs in her dark hair, nor the pearl buttons sewn onto her winter gloves. People envied her because she had been loved in a way that could not be bought. Her mother, Lady Evelina Ashbourne, had filled Ashbourne Hall with music, books, flowers, and paintings. She had been the sort of woman servants spoke of softly even after she left a room, not because they feared her, but because kindness has a way of lingering longer than perfume. When Celeste was little, her mother used to take her to the East Gallery every Sunday afternoon. It was the brightest room in the house, with tall windows facing the gardens and walls covered in family portraits. Celeste remembered standing there in her white muslin dress, her small hand tucked inside her mother's. Portraits are not only for remembering faces, Lady Evelina once told her, they are for remembering who is allowed to matter. Celeste had not understood the sentence then. Years later, she would understand it too well. Lady Evelina died when Celeste was 9. The house did not change all at once. That was the cruel part. Grief came first, honest and terrible. The curtains were drawn. The piano stayed closed. Her father, Lord Ashbourne, walked through the corridors like a man searching for a voice he would never hear again. For a time, Celeste believed sorrow had made the house quiet. Then, her father married again. Lady Maricel Ashbourne arrived at the estate in a carriage lined with blue velvet, wearing a dove-gray gown and a smile so gentle that half the county declared Lord Ashbourne fortunate to have found such a refined woman. She was beautiful, composed, and graceful in every public room. She spoke softly to servants. She wore black for Lady Evelina for exactly the proper amount of time. She kissed Celeste on the forehead in front of guests and called her, "My dear child," in a voice smooth enough to pass for affection. No one saw the first portrait disappear. It had hung beside the library door. Lady Evelina in a pale green gown, holding a book in one hand and a spray of white roses in the other. One morning, Celeste found the wall empty. "It has been moved for cleaning," Lady Maricel said. It never returned. Then another painting was taken down from the music room, then a miniature from the mantel. Then her mother's embroidery frame vanished from the morning parlor. Her sheet music was locked away. Her letters were organized. Her jewels were safeguarded. Her name was spoken less and less until it became something that made people glance at Lady Maricel before saying it. By the time Celeste was 16, Ashbourne Hall no longer looked like the house her mother had loved. It looked like a house that had agreed to forget her. Celeste had not been beaten. She had not been locked in an attic. No visible cruelty marked her life, and perhaps that was why no one came to rescue her. Her gowns were respectable, though never fashionable. Her meals were served on silver. Her room was warm in winter. From the outside, she remained a privileged daughter of an old noble family, but inside that family, she had been slowly erased. Her half-sister, Lady Rosamond, was presented to society the moment she came of age. Rosamond had new gowns for every season, riding lessons, music tutors, invitations, compliments, and a mother who knew exactly where to place her in a room so the right men would notice. Celeste was given duties. She wrote thank-you notes. She arranged old household accounts. She sat beside elderly aunts during dinners. When guests came, she was introduced last, if at all. Lady Maricel never insulted her directly. That would have been vulgar. Instead, she smiled and said things like, "Celeste has always preferred quiet corners," or "My stepdaughter is not made for society's brighter rooms." Eventually, people believed it. Worse, Celeste began to believe it too. By 25, she had become a woman who knew how to enter a room without expecting anyone to turn. She wore pale colors because bright ones seemed to belong to other women. She spoke carefully because every opinion she had ever offered had been gently corrected, ignored, or laughed away. And yet somewhere beneath all that silence, something in her had not died. It waited. That winter, Lady Maricel announced the Ashbourne Charity Auction. Officially, the event was to raise funds for the restoration of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, whose roof had been damaged by autumn storms. The chapel stood on Ashbourne land, and every noble family within 30 miles had been invited. There would be music, supper, donated heirlooms, silverware, lace, paintings, and a final public bidding before midnight. Unofficially, everyone knew the evening had another purpose. Lady Maricel wanted to remind the county that the Ashbournes were still powerful, still generous, still worthy of admiration. Lord Ashbourne's finances had grown strained in recent years, though no one said it openly. A successful charity auction would polish the family name, place Rosamond in front of eligible men, and make Lady Maricel appear benevolent in the eyes of society. Celeste thought she would merely be expected to stand quietly near the wall. She was wrong. On the morning of this auction, a maid came to her room carrying a gown Celeste had not chosen. It was gray-blue, plain at the throat, modest to the point of severity. It made her look less like a young woman and more like a faded memory of one. "Lady Maricel said this would be suitable," the maid whispered. Celeste touched the sleeve and said nothing. Downstairs, Ashbourne Hall was being transformed. Garlands of winter greenery wrapped the banisters. Candles stood in polished brass holders. Footmen carried crates of donated items into the ballroom. Porcelain, jeweled fans, old hunting prints, carved boxes, a cracked marble bust, and several paintings wrapped in linen. Celeste passed the open doors of the ballroom and stopped. 2 servants were carrying in a large gilt frame. Even under the cloth, she knew it. Her breath caught. The portrait had once hung in the East Gallery. It had been painted when Celeste was 7 years old. In the original, she had been seated beside her mother on a garden bench, one hand resting in Lady Evelina's lap. Both of them turned toward the painter as if interrupted in the middle of a private happiness. It had been Celeste's favorite painting in the world. Years ago, after her mother's death, it had disappeared. Now, it had returned. But when one servant shifted the cloth and exposed part of the canvas, Celeste saw that her mother was gone. The garden bench remained. The pale roses remained. Little Celeste remained, stiff and lonely in her white dress. But the place where Lady Evelina had sat had been painted over with a dark curtain. For a moment, Celeste could not move. It felt less like seeing a damaged painting than witnessing a second burial. Lady Maricel appeared behind her, calm as ever. "Oh," she said lightly, "you remember that old thing?" Celeste turned slowly. "Why is it here?" "For the auction, of course." Celeste stared at her. "That was my mother's portrait." "No, my dear," Lady Maricel smiled. "It is your portrait now." The words were soft, but Celeste felt them like a hand closing around her throat. Lady Maricel stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that no servant could pretend to hear. "You must learn to let the dead rest. Besides, a sentimental old painting may still do some good for the chapel. Surely you would not begrudge charity." Celeste looked back at the canvas. The dark curtain painted over her mother's figure seemed almost wet in the morning light. That evening, the ballroom filled with silk, jewels, feathers, polished shoes, and quiet cruelty disguised as conversation. Candles burned in every mirror. Musicians played from the gallery above. Men laughed too loudly near the wine tables. Women lifted fans to hide their whispers. Celeste stood near the side of the room, exactly where Lady Maricel had placed her. Rosamond sparkled in violet satin across the hall, surrounded by admirers. Lord Ashbourne stood beside his wife, looking tired, handsome, and absent in the way he always did when something unpleasant required courage. Then the auctioneer called for the next item. A large covered frame was carried to the front of the ballroom. Celeste felt her hands turn cold inside her gloves. Lady Maricel rose from her chair with the serene expression of a woman about to perform a kindness. "My friends," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room, "our family has always believed in giving what we can for the good of the parish. Tonight, I have decided to part with a little piece of Ashbourne history." The cloth was pulled away. The room saw the portrait. A murmur passed through the guests. There was young Celeste in the painting, small and solemn, seated alone beside a curtain where another life had once existed. Lady Maricel placed one hand over her heart. "This portrait has been in storage for many years," she continued. "I thought it a shame to let it gather dust when it might serve a better purpose." Then she turned her head slightly, just enough for everyone to know she meant Celeste to hear. They laughed when Lady Celeste Ashbourne's portrait was carried onto the auction platform. Not politely, not with the delicate little coughs people used when cruelty needed a lace glove. They laughed openly, behind fans and crystal glasses, beneath chandeliers that turned every smile into something sharp. The portrait was not large. Its gilt frame had darkened with age, its corners chipped where it had once hung in sunlight and later been dragged into storage. In the painting, Celeste was no more than 7 years old, dressed in ivory muslin, her dark hair brushed too smoothly, her small hands folded in her lap as if she had been told not to move. But something about the painting looked wrong. There was too much empty space beside the child, a pale blur where another figure should have been, a heaviness in the background, as though the canvas remembered a person the room had decided to forget. Celeste stood near the back of Lady Winthrop's charity hall, half hidden behind a pillar wrapped in winter roses. She had learned, over many years, where to place herself in rooms like this, near enough to be present, far enough not to be noticed unless someone needed a target. Tonight, unfortunately, her stepmother needed one. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne glided toward the auctioneer with the serene expression that had made half of London call her graceful, and the other half call her dangerous, only in private. She wore burgundy silk and pearls, her copper blonde hair arranged like a crown. No one would have believed such a woman capable of vulgarity. That was why she never needed to be vulgar. She simply smiled.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Winter Roses auction.
Voice warm enough to
we begin
poison,
the bidding at £500.
comes from Ashbourne House itself,
Do I hear
a
6?
childhood portrait of our dear Celeste. I thought it fitting to donate it for charity. After all, if the poor girl has not managed to secure a respectable husband, perhaps her likeness may still earn a few coins for the church. The room broke into laughter. Celeste did not move. She did not lower her head. She had learned that humiliation fed more greedily when it saw tears. So she stood very still, her gloved hands folded before her, and let the laughter pass over her like sleet. Her father, Lord Ashbourne, sat in the front row beside his second wife. He looked down at his program. That, Celeste thought, was what he had always done best. He lowered his eyes whenever looking at her would require courage. Beside him, her half-sister Rosamond covered her mouth with a fan. Whether to hide laughter or shame, Celeste could not tell. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Shall we begin at £10? Silence. A few gentlemen exchanged amused looks. Someone whispered, £10 for Ashbourne melancholy? Too steep." £5 then, the auctioneer said. More laughter. Celeste stared at the painting and tried not to remember the last time she had seen it whole. She had been a child then, small enough to believe a mother's arms could keep a world from breaking. In the original portrait, her mother had sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on Celeste's shoulder. Lady Eleanor Ashbourne had worn a pale blue gown and a ruby and pearl brooch shaped like a small open star. Celeste remembered the brooch better than she remembered some voices. Her mother had told her it belonged to the women of the Vane family, passed not to sons but to daughters who were expected to know the value of their own names. Then Lady Eleanor died, and the portrait disappeared. Years later, it returned to the wall, changed. Her mother was gone from it, painted over, erased. Celeste had been told the damp had damaged that half of the canvas and that the artist had corrected it. Corrected, as if love were an error in composition. £1? The auctioneer tried, now smiling as if the failure itself had become entertainment. Celeste felt the air leave her lungs. Then, from the left side of the hall, a man's voice said, £1 and 10 shillings. The laughter paused. Every head turned. The bidder stood near the service doors, where servants moved in and out with trays of wine. He was not dressed like the gentleman in the front rows. His coat was clean but worn at the cuffs, his dark waistcoat plain, his cravat tied without fashion. He had black hair that refused discipline and a face made more interesting by attention than by beauty. He looked at the painting, not at the room. "Name?" the auctioneer asked, surprised. "Julian Vale," the man replied. A small ripple moved through the guests. Some knew the name, most knew the category. Painter, restorer, tradesman. Someone who entered grand houses through side doors and left with paint beneath his nails. Lady Beatrice's smile thinned. "Mr. Vale," she said sweetly. "How generous." Julian did not bow too low. "The church will have its coins, my lady." The auctioneer lifted his gavel, eager to end the embarrassment before it turned into something less amusing. "Sold to Mr. Julian Vale," the gavel struck. And for the first time that evening, Celeste felt watched, not as a failure, but as a question. Julian Vale looked from the portrait to her. His gaze was quiet, not pitying, not hungry, simply certain, as if he had seen a crack in a wall and knew there was a room behind it. Celeste turned away first. She had no idea that the cheapest object sold that night would become the most dangerous thing in England. Ashbourne House had been built to impress men who pretended not to be impressed by houses. It stood beyond Grosvenor Square behind black iron gates, all pale stone, tall windows, and symmetry sharp enough to feel like judgment. Visitors admired the marble entrance, the Flemish tapestries, the portraits of dead Ashbourne men who had married well, served moderately, and been painted magnificently. What visitors did not see was absence. Celeste saw it everywhere, a rectangle of paler wallpaper in the morning room where her mother's portrait had once hung, a locked cabinet in the music room where her mother's letters had been kept before Lady Beatrice ordered the hinges replaced, a nursery chest in the attic whose contents had been sorted, sold, or burned under the excuse of moths. Lady Beatrice had never struck Celeste. She had never raised her voice in front of servants. She had never used crude insults. Her genius was refinement. She erased with taste. "That gown is a little severe for you, dear. Rosamond carries color better. Perhaps you should sit out this dance. You do look tired." No, we must not trouble Lord Ashbourne with old matters. Your father has had enough grief." Year by year, Celeste had been taught to take up less space. At first she resisted, then she argued, then she learned the uselessness of arguing with someone who could turn every objection into proof of ingratitude. By 26, she had become exactly what Lady Beatrice wanted society to believe she was: composed, unmarried, old-fashioned, and fading. The morning after the auction, Celeste found her stepmother in the breakfast room reading invitations. "You left early last night," Lady Beatrice said without looking up. "The auction had ended." "For most of us, yes. For you, I imagine the entertainment had only begun." Celeste poured tea. Her hands were steady because she had spent half a lifetime teaching them to be. Rosamond sat by the window, turning a bracelet around her wrist. At 20, she was everything London liked to forgive: pretty, careless, adored, and rarely required to be kind for more than a moment at a time. "Mamma," Rosamond said, "must we speak of it?" Lady Beatrice glanced at her daughter. "Of what? Charity? It is never unfashionable to discuss good works." Lord Ashbourne entered then, grey at the temples, already holding a newspaper like a shield. He kissed his wife's cheek, nodded at Rosamond, and looked at Celeste for the length of a breath. "Did you sleep?" he asked. It was such a small question. It almost hurt more than silence. "Well enough, Papa." Lady Beatrice folded an invitation. "Mr. Calder will dine with us Thursday. He has asked particularly after Rosamond." Rosamond brightened. Celeste kept her eyes on her cup. There had been a time when callers asked after Lady Celeste Ashbourne. Not many, perhaps, but some. Lady Beatrice had discouraged them gently. One was told Celeste suffered nerves. Another was told she disliked society. A third was informed she had no dowry worth discussing, which was not true. Though by then Celeste had begun to wonder whether truth mattered if no one powerful cared to repeat it. "And Celeste?" Lord Ashbourne asked, surprising them all. Lady Beatrice smiled. "What of her? Will she join us?" "If she likes. Though Mr. Calder is a lively man, and Celeste has never enjoyed lively company." "I enjoy honesty," Celeste said before she could stop herself. The room stilled. Lady Beatrice's smile remained, but her eyes changed. "How fortunate, then, that you are surrounded by family." Lord Ashbourne rustled the newspaper. Rosamond looked at Celeste with a flicker of discomfort. Celeste rose. "Excuse me." "Where are you going?" her stepmother asked. "For air." "Do not wander too far. London can be unkind to women without purpose." Celeste paused at the door. "Then I shall try to look as if I have one." She left before courage failed her. Outside, the city was awake in gray winter light. Carriages rolled through damp streets. Chimney smoke pressed low over the rooftops. Flower sellers called from corners, their violets bright against the morning gloom. Celeste walked without planning to, past squares and shop fronts and windows filled with ribbons, gloves, books, mourning jewelry, and painted miniatures of people who had not yet been erased. She did not intend to find Julian Vale, but London, for all its size, has a way of leading the desperate toward doors they would never knock on otherwise. His studio occupied the second floor above a frame-maker's shop in a narrow lane off St. Martin's. A painted board hung near the stairs. J. Vale Portraits, Restoration, Cleaning of Old Canvases, Discretion Observed. Celeste stood below it for several minutes. She told herself she had come only to recover dignity, to ask why he had bought the painting, to make sure he did not intend to display her humiliation in some tavern for amusement. The stairs creaked under her boots. At the top, the studio door stood half open. She smelled linseed oil, turpentine, dust, and cold tea. Light fell through tall north-facing windows onto canvases leaning against walls. Saints with cracked halos, naval captains with yellowed varnish, a landscape of ruined abbeys, a noblewoman whose face had been cleaned on one side and left smoky on the other, so she seemed to be emerging from her own ghost. Julian Vale stood at a work table with her portrait lying flat before him. He did not touch it. He studied it. "Lady Celeste," he said without surprise, "you knew I would come." "No, I hoped you might." "That is almost worse." A brief smile touched his mouth. "I can see how it would be." She stepped inside but did not remove her gloves. "Why did you buy it?" "Because it had been altered. Many old paintings are altered. Not like this." He gestured toward the canvas. From this angle, under the clear studio light, the wrongness was worse. The empty area beside the painted child seemed clumsy, almost bruised. "Someone painted over a figure," Julian said, in haste perhaps, or under instruction from someone who cared more that it be hidden than that it be well hidden. Celeste's throat tightened. "My mother." Julian looked at her then, and his expression softened, though not into pity. "You knew." I remembered. No one considered that important. Memory is often inconvenient to people arranging a lie. The sentence struck her strangely. It was too direct for a gentleman and too gentle for an accusation. Celeste walked closer. "Can you restore it?" "Possibly. Slowly. Carefully. Not without risk." "To the painting? To the people who changed it?" She met his eyes. For the first time in years, someone had spoken as though the harm done to her had perpetrators, not simply weather. "What would it cost?" she asked. Julian leaned back against the table. "That depends on what you're asking me to do. If you want the later paint removed and the original composition recovered, I can charge a restorer's fee. If you want the truth, Lady Celeste, I cannot promise what the price will be." How dramatic. Unfortunately, old houses prefer drama. They simply call it inheritance. She almost smiled. It surprised her enough that she looked away. "I do not have independent funds," she said. The admission burned. "Not ones I can access without my father's approval." "Then we will begin without payment." "No, I do not accept charity." "Nor do I offer it." "Then what is it?" Julian considered her. He had paint on his thumb and tiredness beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who had spent more nights with dead people's faces than with living company. "A wager," he said. "If there is nothing beneath the paint, you owe me nothing. If there is something, we will decide then what the work is worth." "And if what you find is painful?" His gaze returned to the portrait. "A covered wound still hurts. Cleaning it only tells you where the pain came from." Celeste's fingers tightened around her reticule. "You speak of paintings as if they are people." "People are often less honest about damage." She should have left. Every sensible instinct told her to leave. But in the painting on the table, a small girl sat beside an absence, and that absence had ruled Celeste's life for too long. "Very well," she said. "Restore it." Julian nodded once. "You may come tomorrow if you wish to watch the first cleaning." "Why would I wish that?" "Because someone removed her from you once. You may want to be present when she returns." Celeste had no answer. She only looked down at the child in the portrait, at that solemn little face painted before it, learned to be silent, and felt the first dangerous thing she had felt in years. Hope. The restoration began with cotton, solvent, patience, and restraint. Julian explained each step not as a lecturer impressing a patron, but as a craftsman respecting a witness. "The top layer is newer," he said, touching a fine brush to the edge of the painted emptiness. "Different hand, different oil. See how it sits on the surface rather than sinking into the weave?" Celeste leaned closer despite herself. "I see only a stain." "That is because you were taught to look away from it." When she glanced at him sharply, he did not apologize. The first day revealed almost nothing. A shift in color, a line that might have been drapery, a shadow where no shadow should have fallen. Yet Celeste went home with her heart beating as if she had stolen something. The second day, a curve emerged beneath the gray-brown overpaint. "A sleeve," Julian said. Celeste stared until her eyes stung. Pale blue, faded but unmistakable, her mother's dress. She had not remembered the exact shade until she saw it. Then memory opened like a door, the smell of lavender water, the rustle of silk, a laugh interrupted by coughing, cool fingers fastening a ribbon at Celeste's neck. Julian quietly set down his brush. "I can stop for today." "No?" "Lady Celeste, no," she said again, softer. "Please continue." He did. In the weeks that followed, Celeste invented reasons to leave Ashbourne House. Visits to the milliner, calls on acquaintances, walks for air. Lady Beatrice watched her with increasing interest, but suspicion required evidence, and Celeste had survived in that house by giving people very little to hold. Julian's studio became the first room in London where she did not feel like an intruder. It was not grand. Rain tapped through one corner of the roof into a blue porcelain bowl. The stove smoked when the wind changed. There was always too much dust and never enough coal, yet everything in it had purpose. Frames stacked by size, pigments labeled in Julian's narrow hand, brushes cleaned and hung to dry, a cracked mirror near the window, a shelf of books on anatomy, chemistry, scripture, and poetry with broken spines. Celeste came first to watch the painting. Then she came for the quiet. Julian did not flatter her. That unsettled her more than praise would have. Men in drawing rooms either ignored her or spoke with the exaggerated courtesy reserved for women believed unlikely to marry. Julian asked what she remembered. He asked what music her mother liked. He asked whether the Ashbourne dining room had always smelled faintly of beeswax and oranges. "Why does that matter?" Celeste asked one afternoon. "It may not." "Then why ask?" "Because restoration is not only paint, it is context. People leave fingerprints in rooms, habits, objects, the way they arrange flowers. If someone tried to erase your mother, they may have missed what they thought too small to matter." Celeste looked around the studio. "You make small things sound powerful." "They are. Large lies often depend on everyone ignoring small truths." She carried that sentence home and found it waiting for her everywhere. Small truths. The way her father's hand trembled when her mother's name was spoken. The way Lady Beatrice never entered the old blue sitting room, though she claimed not to be superstitious. The way one elderly footman stopped polishing silver whenever Celeste asked about the years before the second marriage. Small truths had been knocking at the walls for years. She had simply been too lonely to hear them. One evening, as Julian cleaned the area near the restored sleeve, a faint shape appeared against the blue. A hand, not Celeste's painted child hand folded in her lap, a woman's hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder. Celeste stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. Julian froze. "I'm sorry." "Why?" "Because sometimes proof hurts worse than doubt." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her mother's hand had been there all along, under dirt, under paint, under lies, resting on Celeste's shoulder while Celeste grew up believing no one had stayed. She laughed once, but it broke before it became sound. Julian moved as if to offer comfort, then stopped himself. That restraint undid her. All her life, people had either handled her feelings as inconvenience or used them as evidence. Julian did neither. He gave her the dignity of not being watched too closely while she tried not to fall apart. "She had beautiful hands," Celeste whispered. "Yes." "I had forgotten." "No," Julian said. "You had been made to doubt. That is different." Celeste looked at him then. Something shifted between them, not sudden enough to name, but real enough to fear. Julian must have felt it too, because he turned back to the painting with too much focus. "The varnish here is stubborn," he said. "Is that what we are calling it?" His mouth twitched. "For now." She smiled. It was small, but it was hers. Lady Beatrice noticed the change before anyone else. Cruel people often understand recovery faster than those who love us, because recovery threatens their architecture. "You look almost lively these days," she remarked one morning as Celeste sorted correspondence in the library. "Do I?" "It suits you less than you might hope." Celeste sealed a letter. "I shall try to be appropriately dull at dinner." Lady Beatrice closed the book she had not been reading. "Where have you been spending your afternoons?" "Walking." "In winter?" "I find the cold honest." "Careful, Celeste. Wit on a plain woman can look like resentment." Celeste looked up. For years such comments had entered her like needles. That morning they merely landed. "Then perhaps resentment suits me better than plainness." Lady Beatrice rose. The room seemed to shrink around her. "I have been patient with you," she said. "More patient than most women would have been with another woman's child. You remind me often." Because gratitude does not come naturally to girls who are given too much grief and too little discipline. Celeste felt her pulse in her throat, but she did not look away. What exactly was I given, Lady Beatrice? For the first time, her stepmother did not answer at once. Then she smiled. A home, a name, protection from your own impractical nature. Believe me, had I not intervened, you would have made a spectacle of yourself long ago. Perhaps I still will. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. With whom? There it was. Celeste lowered her gaze to the letters, not in defeat but concealment. No one you would consider important. Then he is no one at all. After she left, Celeste sat very still. A month earlier, Lady Beatrice's disapproval would have felt like a locked door. Now it felt like a map. If her stepmother feared questions, there was something to ask. That afternoon, Celeste arrived at Julian's studio to find him arguing with a man in a clerk's coat. I told you, Julian said, controlled but tense. I need 1 more week. Mr. Vale, rent is not restored by artistic conviction, nor is it improved by repeating itself. The clerk saw Celeste and straightened. Julian's expression closed. We will continue this later, he said. The clerk bowed stiffly and left. Celeste removed her gloves slowly. You're in difficulty. A temporary one. That is what gentlemen call permanent difficulties when a lady is present. I'm not a gentleman. You behave better than most of them. He looked away, and she realized she had embarrassed him. On the work table, the portrait had changed dramatically. Her mother's shoulder and part of her bodice had emerged. The pale blue gown glowed under the grime, but the face remained hidden beneath a stubborn veil of later paint. You should have told me about the rent, Celeste said. Why? Because I am the cause of the delay. You are the cause of the work. That is different. Julian. It was the first time she had used his Christian name without thinking. He heard it. So did she. For a moment, rain ticked against the glass. I have restored bishops whose heirs argued over payment while standing beneath the 10 Commandments, he said lightly. I can survive an impatient landlord. Pride is very expensive. So is dependence. She could not argue with that. They both knew its price. Instead, she looked at the painting. What remains? The face, the hand near your shoulder, and this. He pointed to a dark shape near the woman's throat. A brooch, I think. But the overpaint there is thick. Someone wanted that area especially obscured. Celeste stepped closer. A star. Julian looked at her. You remember? Ruby and pearl. It belonged to my mother's family. She called it the vain star. She said it was not valuable because of the stones, but because of what it meant. What did it mean? I was too young to understand. Something about daughters, something about land that could not be sold by husbands. She frowned. I had not thought of it in years. Julian's attention sharpened. Land. Perhaps. I may be inventing memory from scraps. Scraps are often where documents begin. Documents? He hesitated. Has anyone ever shown you your mother's will? The question was so simple that Celeste almost laughed. Women are not shown documents in Ashbourne House. We are shown flowers, seating charts, and the faces men make when they have already decided our futures. That is not an answer. No, I have never seen it. I was told everything passed properly to my father. By whom? She smiled without humor. Guess. Julian turned back to the portrait. Then we should be careful. You said that before. Now I mean it more. Careful became impossible within a week, not because they were discovered, because Celeste began discovering herself. In Julian's studio, she found she had opinions, strong ones. She disliked sentimental landscapes. She preferred portraits where the sitter looked as though they might interrupt the painter. She hated the fashionable habit of painting women with tiny hands. She knew more about textiles than Julian did, and corrected him when he mistook watered silk for satin. You speak as if you have spent years looking closely, he said. I spent years being told not to speak. Looking was what remained. Then you have been training all along. For what? To notice. No one had ever made her silence sound like an apprenticeship. One afternoon, he asked her to hold a lamp while he examined the canvas edge. Their shoulders nearly touched. Celeste became aware of ordinary things in extraordinary detail. The ink stain on his cuff, the warmth of him in the cold studio, the concentration in his eyes. There, he murmured. Do you see? She did not, because she was looking at him. He turned his head and found her gaze. Neither moved. It would have been easy in another kind of story for him to kiss her then. For the room to flood with confession and music and all the certainty life rarely provides. Julian did not kiss her. He looked away first, not from disinterest, but from discipline. "The stretcher has been tampered with," he said, voice roughened slightly. "Here, a seam." Celeste forced herself to look. Behind the canvas, along the inner edge of the frame, a narrow strip of paper had been tucked beneath old linen tape. Julian did not touch it at once. "This may tear," he said, "and if it is what I think it is, we need a witness. We have each other. That may not be enough for the law. It is enough for me." He looked at her again, and this time the silence was softer. "Lady Celeste," he said carefully, "you must not trust me simply because I am kinder than those who hurt you. That is a low bar, and you deserve higher ground." The words should have wounded her pride. Instead, they steadied it. "Then help me stand on it," she said. He nodded. They left the paper in place that day. Julian sent a note to Mr. Nathaniel Greaves, an elderly solicitor who had once acted for the Vane family. Celeste recognized the name dimly from childhood. Lady Beatrice had dismissed him years before as a tedious old man who enjoyed making grief more complicated. Mr. Greaves arrived 2 days later with spectacles, a silver-topped cane, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a door to reopen. When he saw Celeste, his face changed. "Lady Celeste," he said quietly, "you have your mother's eyes." It was a dangerous kindness. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Mr. Greaves pretended not to notice. Together, they removed the frame backing. Julian worked with tools small enough to seem surgical. Celeste stood beside the table, hands clasped so tightly her gloves creaked. The paper came free in fragments at first, then in one folded sheet, thin and browned at the edges. Mr. Greaves unfolded it with reverence. No one breathed. The writing was faded, but legible. "My dearest Celeste, should this reach you when you are old enough to understand, know first that nothing I leave is given out of bitterness. It is given so that no one may make you small in my absence." Celeste gripped the table. Mr. Greaves stopped reading aloud. His eyes moved quickly over the page. "This is not the full will," he said at last. "It is an accompanying letter, but it references one. The Vane Trust, the Eastmere Estate, the Ashbourne Gallery collection." Julian's face hardened. "Those are not small holdings." "No," Mr. Greaves said. "They are not." Celeste heard the words as if from underwater. Eastmere. Her mother had spoken of Eastmere, a house by a lake, apple trees, a studio with blue shutters where her grandmother had painted birds badly and proudly. "I was told there was nothing," Celeste said. Mr. Greaves removed his spectacles. "There was a great deal. Your mother inherited Vane property under a settlement that protected it from transfer to your father. Upon her death, it was to be held for you until you reached 25. Celeste was 26. The room tilted. Julian moved closer, but did not touch her. "Sit down." "No." Celeste. Her name, without title, spoken like a hand offered and not a command. She sat. Mr. Greaves looked deeply troubled. "I wrote to Ashbourne House when you reached your majority, twice. I received replies indicating you were ill, then traveling, then unwilling to be troubled by legal matters. The signatures were your father's." Celeste closed her eyes. Her father. Not ignorant then. Not entirely. Weakness had a signature. "Could they have forged him?" Julian asked. "Perhaps," Mr. Greaves said, but his tone did not believe it. "But there are ledgers, trustees, transfers. If the trust has been mismanaged or concealed, there will be evidence." Celeste opened her eyes. "My stepmother knew. Very likely. My father knew." Mr. Greaves was kind enough not to answer quickly. That was answer enough. Celeste rose and walked to the window. Outside, the lane below moved on with ordinary London indifference. A boy delivered bread. A woman shook rain from an umbrella. A carriage wheel struck a puddle. Her life had been stolen in daylight. Not with locked towers or shouted curses, but with letters unanswered, portraits altered, invitations withheld, confidence sanded down until she mistook disappearance for personality. Behind her, Julian spoke softly. "You do not have to decide anything today." She turned. "Yes," she said. "I do." Mr. Greaves straightened. Celeste looked at the half-restored portrait. Her mother's face was still hidden, but her hand rested clear and steady on the child's shoulder. "Finish the painting," Celeste said. "Find the will, gather whatever proof the law requires, and then we will show them exactly what they sold." For the first time, Mr. Greaves smiled. Julian did not. He looked at her with something fiercer than admiration, respect. Lady Beatrice's winter exhibition was meant to be her triumph. She had planned it for months, a charitable display of private collections from distinguished houses, with proceeds pledged to a hospital ward bearing the Ashbourne name. The guest list included dukes, critics, bishops, patrons, and every person who had laughed at Celeste in Lady Winthrop's hall. Ashbourne House glittered for the occasion. Candelabra burned in polished mirrors. Musicians played beneath the staircase. Footmen carried champagne. The great gallery, once a room of family memory, had been arranged as a theater of reputation. Lady Beatrice moved through it like a queen who had written every line of the play. Celeste entered late. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that had belonged to no one else. It was simple, almost severe, with a square neckline and sleeves fitted at the wrist. Around her throat was no jewelry. She wanted the absence noticed. Rosamond saw her first. "Celeste," she whispered, "you came." "I was invited." Mama did not think. "I know what your mother thinks." Rosamond flinched. She looked younger than usual, less polished. "Something is happening, isn't it?" Celeste studied her half-sister. For years, Rosamond had enjoyed the sunlight redirected from Celeste without asking who had been left in shade. But she had not created the darkness. Not at first. "Yes," Celeste said. "Something is happening. You will need to decide whether you want to know the truth before everyone else does." Rosamond's face paled. Before she could answer, Lady Beatrice appeared. "Celeste," she said, all honey and steel. "How unexpected." "At a family exhibition? You so rarely enjoy being looked at." "That has begun to change." Lady Beatrice's eyes moved over her gown, her posture, her unadorned throat. Suspicion sharpened. "Where have you been?" "Learning the value of old things. How quaint. You may think so." The music continued. People laughed, glasses chimed. No one yet understood that the air had changed. Then the doors at the end of the gallery opened. Julian Vale entered with two porters carrying a covered painting. The room did not fall silent at once. It murmured first, confused. Julian was not dressed as a guest. His black coat was plain, his gloves marked from handling the frame, his hair refusing formality as always. Yet he walked with the calm of a man who knew precisely why he had come. Behind him came Mr. Greaves carrying a leather document case. Lord Ashbourne saw the solicitor and went grey. Lady Beatrice's smile vanished for less than a second. Only Celeste was close enough to enjoy it. "What is this?" Lady Beatrice asked. Celeste turned to the room. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "An addition to the exhibition. A family portrait restored after many years of concealment." Whispers spread. The painting was placed on an easel beneath the central chandelier. The cloth covering it was plain white. Celeste stood beside it. Julian stood a little behind, as if refusing to claim the center of her moment. That nearly broke her composure more than cruelty ever had. Lady Beatrice stepped forward. "This is absurd. No work is displayed in my gallery without my approval." "Your gallery?" Mr. Greaves said mildly. The question landed like a dropped blade. Lord Ashbourne gripped the back of a chair. Lady Beatrice turned to him. "Say something." For once, he did not know where to look. Celeste reached for the cloth. The room held its breath. She pulled it down. Her mother returned to Ashbourne House in silence. Lady Eleanor Ashbourne sat in the restored portrait, radiant not with youth alone, but with presence. The pale blue gown had been recovered, the graceful neck, the dark eyes so like Celeste's, the hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. At her breast gleamed the vein star, ruby center, pearl points, painted with such care that even across the gallery it seemed to catch fire. The child Celeste no longer looked abandoned. She looked beloved. No one laughed. Celeste heard a small sound from Rosamond and turned to see her half-sister staring at the painting, as though seeing Celeste for the first time. Mr. Greaves opened his document case. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I apologize for intruding upon a charitable evening, but certain legal facts have been concealed long enough. The late Lady Eleanor Ashbourne, born Eleanor Vane, left a protected trust to her only daughter, Lady Celeste Ashbourne. This trust includes Eastmere Estate and the Ashbourne Gallery collection presently displayed in this house. Lady Celeste became entitled to direct control upon reaching 25. The gallery erupted in whispers. Lady Beatrice's face hardened. "This is outrageous." "It is documented," Mr. Greaves said. The restored portrait contained Lady Eleanor's accompanying letter, hidden within the original frame. The full will, copies of which were preserved in my office, confirms the terms. Recent correspondence from Ashbourne House misrepresented Lady Celeste's willingness and capacity to receive her inheritance. Lord Ashbourne sat down as if his knees had failed. Celeste looked at him. "Did you sign them?" The question was quiet. That made it worse. Her father covered his face with one hand. Lady Beatrice answered for him. "Your father was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed by matters you could not possibly understand. I managed what he could not. You stole what was mine. I preserved this family. You erased my mother." Lady Beatrice's composure cracked. "Your mother was dead." The words rang through the gallery. Celeste stepped closer to the portrait, and still she protected me better than the living did. No one spoke. For years, Lady Beatrice had controlled rooms by deciding what could be said. Now the truth stood framed in gold beneath every candle, and even those who wished to look away had nowhere safe to rest their eyes. Rosamond moved to her mother's side, then stopped. Lady Beatrice reached for her. "Rosamond." Rosamond looked from the restored portrait to Celeste, then to the jewels at her own wrists, the gown bought for the season, the life arranged with money she had never questioned. "Did you know?" she asked her mother. "Do not be childish." "Did you know?" Lady Beatrice's silence was answer enough. Rosamond stepped back. It was not a grand rebellion, no speech, no tears, just one step. But Celeste saw what it cost. Mr. Greaves continued with names, dates, trustees, and legal phrases that turned scandal into structure. The more he spoke, the smaller Lady Beatrice seemed, not because she lost beauty, but because beauty without control had never been her true power. The guests who had laughed weeks before now watched Celeste with new calculation, some with sympathy, some with embarrassment, some already rewriting their own memories to place themselves on the right side of the story. Celeste did not need them. She looked at Julian. He was watching the painting, not the crowd. That was when she knew she loved him. Not because he had restored her mother, not because he had uncovered a fortune, not because he had stood beside her in a room that wished to swallow her whole. Because even at the moment when all eyes turned toward revelation, he still looked at the work, at the truth itself, as though it mattered more than applause. The exhibition ended in ruin for Lady Beatrice and beginning for Celeste. By midnight, the Ashbourne name was no longer polished silver. It was a cracked bell ringing through London. By morning, every drawing room had its version. Some said Lady Celeste had been wronged tragically. Some said she had orchestrated revenge with theatrical brilliance. Some said no gentleman would marry a woman who exposed family secrets so publicly. Celeste read none of it. She spent the next day at Mr. Greaves's office signing documents with a hand that shook only once. Eastmere was hers. The Ashbourne Gallery collection was hers. The trust income, much diminished by mismanagement but still considerable, was hers. Her father came in the afternoon. He looked older than he had 2 days before. "Celeste," he said. She waited. He removed his hat, turned it in his hands, and for once had no newspaper, no wife, no formalities to stand behind. "I failed you." The words were too small for the damage, but they were the first honest thing he had offered her in years. "Yes," she said. He flinched. He said, I told myself Beatrice understood practical matters. I told myself your mother's family had made things difficult. I told myself you were safe, housed, cared for. I did not look closely because looking closely would have required me to act." Celeste thought of Julian's studio, of varnish, solvent, patience, of hidden layers. "Did you love her?" she asked. Her father's eyes filled. "Your mother, more than I deserve to." "Then why did you let her disappear?" Lord Ashbourne sat in the chair beside the solicitor's desk. He did not answer for a long time. "Because disappearing is easier than defending," he said at last. "And because Beatrice made it possible to live in a house without ghosts. I did not realize she had only locked them away." It was not forgiveness, Celeste felt. It was the beginning of understanding what forgiveness might one day require. "You will need to speak to the trustees," she said. "I know." "And to Rosamond." "I know." "And to me, properly. Not with programs and newspapers between us." Her father looked at her as if seeing a woman where he had expected a child. "You look like your mother," he said. "I know," Celeste said. "That is partly why you could not look at me." He didn't deny it. She left him sitting alone. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of solitude he had allowed her to endure for years. Perhaps it would teach him something. Perhaps not. But it was no longer her duty to make his discomfort bearable. Julian was waiting outside, not at the door, not on the steps. Across the street, beside a lamppost, with his hands in his coat pockets and his collar turned up against the wind. He looked like a man prepared to wait all afternoon and pretend he had simply been passing. Celeste crossed toward him. "You are a terrible liar," she said. "I was not lying. You were standing in the rain pretending you were not waiting. That is called manners. It is called cowardice dressed in a coat," he smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, unguarded, crooked, and devastating. "How did it go?" he asked. "Eastmere is mine. The gallery is mine. The trust is mine." "And your father?" "Broken. Honest. Late." Julian nodded. He did not ask whether she had forgiven Lord Ashbourne. He understood that some questions were rooms you could not enter beside another person. They walked. London moved around them with its usual indifference to private revolutions. Carriages passed, a boy sold newspapers, a dog barked at nothing, rain softened to mist. "What will you do with Eastmere?" Julian asked. "Visit it, learn it, decide whether I can love a place I was robbed of." "And the gallery? Keep it, fill it. Begin with portraits of women who were never painted because no one thought them worth remembering." He stopped walking. Celeste turned. "What?" "Nothing. That was simply the most extraordinary sentence I have heard this year. It is January. I stand by it." She laughed. The sound surprised them both. It was not the careful, restrained sound she had trained herself to make in drawing rooms. It was genuine, startled, and brief, like a bird released from a room it had forgotten had windows. Julian watched her with an expression she could not name. It was not the polished admiration of ballroom suitors or the calculating warmth of men who saw an heiress before they saw a woman. It was quieter than that, steadier. "I should tell you something," he said. "That sounds ominous." "It may be." She waited. "I didn't buy the painting only because it had been altered." He paused. "I bought it because of the way you stood when they laughed." Celeste's breath caught. "I have spent 10 years surrounded by portraits of people pretending to be strong," Julian continued. "I know what composed suffering looks like on canvas, but that night, in that room, you were not pretending. You were enduring. And I thought, if a woman can stand like that while everything around her is designed to make her fall, then whatever is hidden in that painting is worth finding." The rain continued, fine and indifferent. Celeste looked at him for a long time. "That is the most dangerous compliment I have ever received," she said. "Why dangerous?" "Because I believe it. I believe." Neither moved. Then Celeste stepped forward, took his hand, and held it. His fingers closed around hers, paint-stained and warm. They stood in the rain like two people who had found the beginning of something neither had been taught to expect. Not a rescue, not a transaction, not a fairy tale dressed in candlelight. A choice. Made by a woman who had learned that silence was not emptiness, that patience was not weakness, and that the most powerful thing a person could do was refuse to disappear. The portrait of Lady Eleanor Ashbourne was returned to Ashbourne House 1 month later, not to a dark corridor, not to storage, to the East Gallery, where the light was best, where the tall windows faced the gardens, and where a small girl had once stood holding her mother's hand. Celeste hung it herself, and beside it, she placed a new painting. It showed a woman in a deep blue gown, standing alone in a room full of candles, one hand resting on the back of a chair, looking directly at the painter with an expression that was neither proud nor humble. It was simply present. Julian had painted it the week before. He had not told her it was finished until she arrived at the studio and found it drying on the easel, still smelling of oil and turpentine. "When did you do this?" she had asked. "Between your mother's face and the varnish coat. You painted me in secret. I painted you from memory. You sat in that chair every afternoon for weeks. I could not have forgotten your face if I had tried. Did you try?" "Once. I failed immediately." She had looked at the portrait for a long time. It was not flattering in the way society portraits were flattering. It did not soften her jaw or enlarge her eyes or add roses to her complexion. It showed her as she was, serious, watchful, tired around the edges, and alive. "You made me look like someone who matters," she said. "You always mattered." I simply agreed with the canvas. The portrait hung in the East Gallery now, beside her mother's. 2 women, 2 eras, 2 different kinds of survival, and between them, not a fairy tale, but a truth. That being forgotten is not the same as being gone, and that some women do not need a crown to reclaim a kingdom. They only need someone honest enough to help them see what was hidden, and brave enough to stand beside them when the frame comes down.